We're going to be looking in Galatians 3 in just a second, and so you might want to be there. We'll get there eventually anyway. I'm going to read first from a little obscure passage from the Old Testament. If someone has committed a crime worthy of death and is executed and hung on a tree, the body must not remain hanging from the tree overnight. You must bury the body that same day, for anyone who is hung is cursed in the sight of God. In this way, you will prevent the defilement of the land the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession. All of us have a question we got to ask somewhere along the way. How do I know who I am? What is my identity? Where do I get it from? What's my significance being here in the world? And maybe most important of all is, what's the basis of my acceptance with God? And along the way comes religion, and religion gives us a pathway to God. But most religion ends up being the curse it seeks to relieve. I will never forget calling a friend of mine. We're going to call him Chuck. It's not his real name. And said, I need to come visit with you. And I get to his house, and I'm sitting there, and he thinks I'm there to talk about his son, who's gone through a series of infidelities in the first year of his marriage. And so we began to talk about his son. And I said, Chuck, I'm not here to talk about your son. I'm here to talk about how your son learned to do what he did from you. And then I had to confront him about an adulterous relationship he was having with another one of his son's best friend's mom. Just happened to be the week of graduation for that son. If you know Chuck's story, you understand how he got in the mess he got in. It doesn't justify it, but you understand. Chuck's brilliant. Smart a person as I know. He is a certified professional engineer, civil engineer. But he was bored with that, and so he wrote a computer program that basically most major cities still use today, or some form of it, to chart runoff of water and that kind of stuff. And then from there he went into computer programming, and now he runs a division of computer programming from one of the best computer software firms you know about. But Chuck had to be best at everything. You didn't play a pickup basketball game unless you wanted a fat lip or a bloody nose if you were going to play with Chuck, because he was going to do everything to win, including cheat. In fact, I still remember when he and I and another guy played our three sons in basketball before their senior year, and they had never beat us, and then this time they beat us. Oh, man, they beat us. I think we scored 2 out of 21, something like that. But we cheated, and he cheated worst of all because he had to win. He had an incredible vocabulary, a voracious reader, well-rounded in what he read, because he always felt like he had to be the smartest person in the room, the most informed. And when I began to poke him and say, why are you this way? Why do you have to drive to a Spurs game from Austin to San Antonio faster than any living human being can do it? And we came on the solution. As brilliant as he was, as accomplished as he was, with all the things he had done, he had never heard his dad say, I love you, I'm proud of you, until after he was 41 years old. He didn't know his identity. And he approached religion the same way. He was very intolerant of those who had difficulties in their lifestyle, because he felt like by the pure gumption and determination of his will that he conquered everything else, he would be a moral man better than his daddy. And so we sit there across the way with me confronting him about something that deep in his soul was unconscionable to him. Blew apart two families, broke the hearts of a bunch of boys, because both families had boys. Threatened to rock a Christian school to the ground and produced havoc in the church where he was a leader and ran their missions program. Religion for him was the same curse that everything else was. I've got to do it. I've got to be the best. I've got to make myself acceptable to God. I've got to show God that I'm worth His love. And you dig around in all religion, and that's really what all other religions outside of Jesus Christ is about. You've got to be good enough to get to the next level for God, or whatever you understand God to be, to accept you. So Paul goes to the little church in Galatia, a series of churches in a little part, not too far from where he had spent a lot of time, and he goes to these churches, and these churches had heard the gospel about Jesus Christ. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you're buried with Him in baptism, that cross that He went to and hung and died for your sins, and that resurrection He was a part of, if you do that, if you share in that through baptism, he talks about in Galatians 2:20, then Christ is alive in you, and God accepts you by grace. But before long, these religious teachers kind of snuck in, and they began to say, yeah, that's true, God accepts you by grace, but to really prove to Him that you're worthwhile, you've got to do this and this and this and this. And they pulled out some Old Testament stuff, and they said, if you don't do this, you're not really going to measure up, you're not really spiritual. And they took the grace of Jesus, the good news, and they made people twice a child of hell than they were when they began. Because they substituted God's acceptance and put in its place their achievement. So Paul has to write and address that issue. And we're not going to read the whole passage, Galatians 1 through 21, but we're going to begin with verse 10. But those who depend on doing the law to make them right with God are under a curse. They're under a curse. For the Scriptures say, the very Scriptures they were quoting, the very Scriptures they were making their list out of how to get to God, the Scriptures say, cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the commands that are written in the book of God's law. All right, how many of you used a mirror this morning? Okay? Maybe we ought to ask who didn't use a mirror this morning. A mirror is an interesting thing. I mean, we got them all around the room. A mirror is an interesting thing. It can show you what's wrong, but it can't fix anything, can it? That's the problem. Every morning you stare in the mirror and it shows you, the goo on your cheek from a good night's sleep, and your hair going 64 different directions, and the wrinkles from the pillows in your face, and all that kind of stuff. And then you look and you say, whoa, that guy's about 15 years older and 15 pounds heavier than I remember. And it tells you what's wrong with you, but it can't fix squat diddly do, can it? It can't fix anything. And that's what Paul's saying. This law is good because it points out what's wrong, but if we try to use the law, we try to use these religious works to be good enough for God to accept us, we're going to trip on something, and when we do, we're guilty of all of it because the law is no better than the mirror. It just shows us what's wrong. So how do we get past that? Well, he goes on and he says, so it's clear that no one can be made right with God by trying to keep law. For the Scriptures say, if through faith, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. The way of faith is very different than the way of law, which says it is through obeying the law that a person has life. You see the difference? Religion says you obey these rules and God likes you. Faith says, Jesus died for me, I trust Him to take care of that, and I place my trust not in what I can do, but what He did. He goes on, chapter 3. But Christ has rescued us from the curse pronounced by the law. When He was hung on the cross, He took upon Himself the curse for our wrongdoing. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. For us, it's hard for us to understand the meaning of a cross for somebody like Jesus. The Romans found out real quickly that Jews hated crosses. There are lots of other ways to torture somebody to death. Some of them even more painful than a cross. But for a Jew, there's nothing more emotionally painful, more humiliating than a cross, because their very own law says anybody that is hung on a cross is cursed by God. He has rejected them. He has damned them. He is apart from them. He wants no part of them. They're cursed. They're doomed. But Paul turns it around and says, God said, cursed is anyone hung on a tree, and that's where I'll go in my Son. And I do it for one reason. Now, I can interpret tongues, so I'm going to interpret that. The reason He did it is to remove from us the curse of trying to have to be the best person in the room, the smartest person in the room, the most righteous person in our own deeds, or God's not going to love us. Because eventually, sooner or later, this morning, one of our guys that goes to Africa a lot did a little communion thought, and he wasn't part of the focus of communion, but one of the things he said was powerful. He talks about an old African who's the brother of the chief of a tribe, and how he's finally convinced that Jesus came and died for him, and he said, it's time for me now to go believe that. And he has to have two people help him down this rocky embankment to get to the water to confess Christ and be baptized. And they take him out there and they baptize him in that water. He says, I believe Jesus died for my sins, and when I'm raised up, I'm going to be God's son. And the guy comes up with a towel and says, you going to towel off? And he said, no. I want the waters of forgiveness to dry on my skin.
Right on. Right on.
What Jesus did was come and take the curse of the law, of law-keeping, of do-goodism, of self-righteous behavior, and nail it to the tree and liberate us. And say, you can be God's son. You can be God's daughter. But it's not by achievement. It's by acclamation. When you say, I trust my sufficiency, my identity, my perfection is in Jesus, then God says, you're my child, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. That's good news.
Amen.
That's liberation from having to try to be the best person in the room or feeling less than. Chuck, he took the confrontation pretty well. In the coming days, he would be shattered completely. He went before the church family he had. He said, this is what I did. Now, why one of these, I've kind of gotten away from Jesus, he told the truth. When he told the truth and was honest about himself, he came to this deep, gut-wrenching understanding. That as much as he felt humiliated for being the person he was, The person he had humiliated was his wife. And when she, through pain and anguish and assertiveness, helped him understand her love wasn't going to give up on him, but he was going to have to show he really loved her, then he understood somebody taking the curse of what he had done and turning it into grace that redeemed him. That's what Jesus did for us.
Mhm.
So may the waters of forgiveness be dried and stuck to your skin, and you can taste the sweetness of grace.
Amen.